Thank you very much indeed for the introduction. Congratulations to those of you who have lasted a whole day of very, very rich presentations, and I'm going to keep mine short. And actually, it's very connected, I think, closely with some of the issues that were raised from the last paper. So I want to ask the question, in terms of interfaith dialogue, Catholic engagement with other religions, does natural law theory offer a good resource in terms of the context of that engagement? Unfortunately, when I was asked to do this paper, I came across the International Theological Commission's document of 2009, which gave me an answer. And the answer was yes. And the document is called "In Search of a Universal Ethic, a New Look at the Natural Law." And I'm not here concerned to talk about the way in which it tries to present natural law in the light of the various challenges, although in fact a number of those topics have been covered already. What I would like to look at is the way it suggests natural law can allow us to engage with other religions. And in one sense, I have to admit, when I first read it, I thought it was a bit stretched and it would be a difficult job. But then I thought I must try and be resourceful here. So this is the result of it. Now, I wanted to try and choose a really difficult example, just because difficult examples make it more convincing if you can argue your way out of it. So I will choose, I think, one of the most difficult examples from Hinduism, and I've chosen Hinduism in particular because Jews and Muslims and Catholics have actually gone a long way on the whole topic of natural law. Hardly surprising, since in all of those three traditions, Aristotle is incorporated in certain philosophical elements, so that we have, in the modern period, a kind of really fast forward movement with forms of Judaism connected with Maimonides, the philosophical development there, in Islam through Averroes, and a minority tradition that should get much more coverage, where reason is an important element in terms of the defense of faith. But when we come to Hinduism and Buddhism, we really do hit a bit of a brick wall, because Aristotle didn't get there. We've got alien types of philosophical systems with the question, can there be engagement connection with this type of tradition? Now, the ITC document sketches out, very admittedly superficially because it's covering a lot of things, its conviction, and I quote here, that if we look at different religions and non-religious traditions, we will find something, quote, to testify to the existence of a patrimony of values common to all human beings, no matter how these values are justified within a particular worldview. Manifest not least in the golden rule, and what you hate, do not to anyone. And as is found in one form or another in the majority of wisdom traditions. Okay, so Martin Ganeri, Dominican Thomist, wrote a very excellent essay pointing out to the difficulty of applying this whole point of convergence with Hinduism, because specifically Hinduism's universal laws, the universal law of dharma, the general principle, is applied concretely and specifically only to the Hindu caste group, and therefore immediately doesn't allow the universalization of the Dharma, and it also has the very particular ways in which prudentially the Dharma is applied, such that Ganeri says that the examples given by the ITC are in danger are in danger of being facile because they do not take seriously, and this is a kind of McIntyre point which is raised, the incommensurability between the two traditions. Metaphysically, cosmologically, ethically, they are vastly different, operating in different kind of orbits. So the real challenge is, can natural law bridge those potentially incommensurable gaps? And very interestingly, McIntyre sort of shows in his own attempt at talking about Confucianism that actually it is possible when you take incommensurably not all the way down, but as a sign of the difficulty of different systems engaging. So what I shall do then, because I need to kind of give a bit of background in Hinduism, is jump straight into the material. I've decided to choose an example that's pretty revolting to me instinctively in Hinduism. And I don't do this in a negative sense, right? Which is the tradition of sati, the immolation of a wife on a funeral pyre. And I can kind of do this safely to some extent because, of course, it is illegal now in India. And interestingly, the British were very resistant to interfering with Hindu religious practices, didn't want to ban it because it would be a kind of colonial move against the religion of the Hindus. And it was actually Hindu movements that put pressure on the British government to make it illegal. So we're talking about something that Hinduism doesn't value any longer, officially speaking, but I think it's a brilliant instantiation of a general law with the question, can this seemingly revolting, almost evil sort of act contain any connection in terms of understanding what motivates it within the Hindu tradition, which would allow natural law theory to illuminate it? Okay, so the answer is going to be, I'll kill the drama in case you fall asleep. The answer is going to be yes, there is a connection. And hopefully that will keep you awake to think, how on earth could such a bizarre, horrific act have any connection with the natural law? Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to tell you about Sati. So, yeah. Yeah, I'll explain. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so the tradition of Sati is illegal, outlawed, and banned. It is a tradition whereby the wife of a husband who has died would have two kind of options. One is they may choose the path of being a widow. The other option is the path of Sati, which is to be immolated upon the funeral pyre of the husband. Okay, so it's self-immolation of the woman on the funeral pyre. Does that answers the point? Sorry? Maybe if I can just go through it and then in the question bit come up. Sorry, I will. It's quite an alien thing that I'm plonking in and introducing. So the question then is, how do we map the meaning of sati? And what I want to use is a 16th century text that was written for the royal court in Tanjore. And it's a text by Trayambakachan, who is a court Pandit, Brahmin, theologian, philosopher, and priest. And in his document, The Guide to the Religious Status and Duties of Women, he outlines how the general law of dharma, which is to do good, to follow one's duty, and pursue what is right, becomes implemented specifically in the role of the wife in the instance where her husband dies first. In explaining this, he outlines a number of points which are very important. The first is, he's at pains to explain this is not an act of suicide, because an act of suicide is not allowed. It is against the Dharma. It is doing harm. He draws the example, which is a very typical example, of the warrior, the second major caste group, who may, because of duty, have to go into war, knowing that he will die, and that cannot be construed as an act of suicide. Therefore, Trambayakajan argues that in this instance, if a woman freely chooses sati, number one, it cannot be understood as suicide and therefore is not prohibited against the tradition. Second point he wants to make is that a woman should never be forced to do this, and in his estimation, most women are not capable of it. They have too many crazy thoughts. Possibly when their husbands died, they are full with both sorrow but lust as well. He also argues that a sinful woman will find it very difficult to carry out this act. Third point he wants to make, and it's important to understand the ritual duties in Hinduism. We have three types. There are obligatory duties that every Hindu must do, such as prayer. Doing that incurs merit, although it is obligatory, it must be done. There's a second category, which is occasional acts of merit, such as marriage. It may be that one gets married once, so it's an occasional act, and in carrying out marriage, one accrues certain types of merit because it is a good action. The third category is the optional type of meritorious act, and this is where sati is situated. So he is arguing it is not required, it is an option, and it is meritorious. The question is then, what sort of benefit can it have for the woman who makes this option? And this is where we get to the heart of the understanding religiously of sati. And I reiterate, because I don't want to mislead, I'm not in any sense wanting to underwrite or affirm the practice. I'm interested in the logic behind the explanation of this tradition. So when he gets to this point of the argument, he begins to then say, there is in sati a particular transgression of the normal karmic acts. Now, this is a really important point. All actions have good or bad fruits. Every action that the person do in the general law of dharma means they accrue the good or bad fruits and they won't go away. So when you die, you will have to undergo the good or bad fruits that you have built up in life. It's a kind of strict moral universe. So now this is the important bit of the transaction. He argues that a woman who freely undertakes sati because of her devotion to the dharma, to the law and the option that is open to her, can actually accrue three types of merit. The first form of merit is that in undertaking this ritual act, she undoes the sins, her own lack of good fruits in life, such that she is cleansed. And he brings in a very interesting argument that this is actually based on the whole notion of the Vedic sacrifice. Okay, so that there's a sacrifice being undertaken which undoes the negative fruits of karma for the person who's undertaking it. And that's kind of making sense in terms of the logic of karma. The second fruit, and this is where it gets really quite fascinating, he argues that there can be a transference of merit, that the woman in undertaking this act can transfer the merit of her good act so that it can actually redeem her husband. And he makes this remarkable point, which in terms of Hindu cosmology is quite shocking because he's actually in a royal court. He argues that not only can it save her husband from all of the transgressions he's committed, it can even save him from the worst sort of transgression, which is killing a Brahmin. Okay, so you kill the highest caste Hindu, that really incurs a lot of bad merit. And this wife has the ability to undo, if you like, the most grievous sin. And there's a lovely quotation from the text, which I will read here. Even in the case of a husband who has entered into hell itself, and who, seized by the servants of death and bound with terrible bonds, has arrived at the very place of torment, even if he is already standing there, helpless and wretched, quivering with fear because of his evil deeds, even if he is a Brahmin killer or the murderer of a friend, even then, a woman who refuses to become a widow, i.e. by choosing Sati, can purify him. In dying, she takes him with her. Okay, so there's no commensurate equivalent of hell and heaven here. The more important point is that the woman has transferential merit attached to this act. The third level of transferential merit is that not only is it to the husband, but it can be in the case of a Sati who is pure and does not have many sins to atone for. The transferential merit can be actually applied to the wider community, to both the husband and her own family. In the case of very famous satis, it is also said to apply to the whole community, including people who come to the sati shrine to do puja and devotion. Now, it took someone like Robert de Nobley, who witnessed in a remarkable act, which is scary to think about. In 1606, the great Rajput prince, Nayak Krishnapur, died. And since he had a lot of wives, 404, there was a mass sati. De Nobley witnessed this. And his reaction was very interesting. It's reported that, and I quote, he rued the fact that the Sati were not co-religionists, since such would have further heightened the glories of Christian martyrology. Interesting insight. I mean, de Nobley was understanding the transaction of transferential merit that I'm talking about. So the question I want to ask now is, in the midst of such a kind of horrific ritual act, can we see a pattern of natural law, given that all ritual acts must be committed in some way to the good? And I think this was the kind of tail end of the discussion of your talk, Sister Catherine. Can we connect with this? But even more importantly, can the connection lead to, and the ITC make this point very strongly, the natural law should also be connected to Christological themes because it has that purpose and function. Okay, so I'm going to try and do all that in about 7 minutes and suggest it's a plausible way to do it, and then you can say not convinced. So the first point then, in trying to say, here we have something rather important, is that the law of dharma definitely operates with the principle that one must seek to do the good, and the good is not simply for oneself, but the good of the community. That's the general law. If you're a warrior caste, if you're a Brahmin caste, if you're a woman, if you're a man, etc., as you're plotted onto the dharma as it descends into the level of prudential application in texts called the Dharma Sastras, we find then out how this is worked out. So the first point is there is a point of connection in terms of the general law of dharma, although it sits in a very, very different cosmological, ontological worldview. So there's no neat assimilation. The second point is that as we look at this law applied, we find both the affirmation of a law that abides throughout the universe, the dharmic law, but also the possibility of how that law can be shifted through sacrifice. Now that again is internal logic to the Vedas and the importance of sacrifice. But what I think is really interesting is we have a doctrine of transferential merit, whereby the actions of one person can be understood to redeem another person from the punishment that is due to them. You can see the plot line now. The third point I want to make is that in the middle or in the midst of this practice, can we see a pattern whereby we can say there is a logic here for a preparatio evangelica, that the gospel can actually speak into this situation because it contains a logic that points towards, if you like, Christ as the supreme Sati. I say that with some tentative care, but I'm just speaking among friends who are all tired and need something to keep them awake. So Christ as the supreme Sati is a way of introducing the dramatic and radical idea that both there is a law that is upheld in the universe and that humans freely can act so as there can be a change in that law, and one human in particular acts so as to undo and not require any further sacrifices. This is a kind of theme, analogically, one might find in the book of Hebrews in discussing the necessity of the sacrifice and the repeat of sacrifices. So you will notice, I think, I hope, that there's an attempt to say Hinduism has a point of contact where we can actually look even at its darkest moments according to its own tradition now. I should say in brackets, while Sati is illegal, it still carries on in the district of North India. There's some horrific accounts because of the fact if it's illegal, they're all carried out with all sorts of subterfuge, but quite interestingly, after it was made illegal, there was one particular Sati who, in her act of self-immolation, became heralded in the district. The state ordered that there could not be any memorial to her, but a memorial was put up. The state ordered no one could visit it, but people did. The military were called out, but were very reticent to actually, like the British, intervene in the religious practices of Hindus. So it is a practice that still carries on, but I've written about the actual case because it's a very interesting one. The point that I want to finish with is, if it's possible to take a particular act which seems so dissimilar, so outrageously odd, and yet part of traditional Hinduism until recently, to show these points of connection, to be able to narrate the possibility that the Christian message really does speak to the inner logic of the Hindu form of dharma, then we have two most important things going on. We have genuine interreligious dialogue, although I'm talking to dead texts, and no Hindu will come out publicly and want to defend this practice, but it's a sort of form of interreligious dialogue with dead texts. But secondly, it's also a point that I'm wanting to underline, that all engagement with other religions must also have a missionary dimension, otherwise it's not real engagement. It's maybe phenomenological study, it's maybe praise, all of those things are great. But in the end, the natural law potentially gives us the resource to engage at two different levels. To recognize how in Hinduism, there's a move away from how the natural law is broken through grace, in inverted commas. And in this instance, Christ as a figure who can remove and redeem the sins of the world, who can even descend to possible Brahmin killers or Christ killers, so that they may be redeemed from the jaws of hell. Okay, I'll stop there so we can have enough discussion.
Thank you, Professor D'Costa. So we have several minutes for questions.
Thank you, Professor, for that interesting presentation. Two questions. One is related to the limitations of the applicability of dharma, as you pointed out. If dharma applies only to kind of ethnicity, it would seem that this is not unique to Hinduism. Right, there are other groups or religions that say we have a law that applies to us, and then there's a law that applies to the other. And to me, it's an interesting issue as to whether the universality of the natural law, as such, breaks the ethnic moral mindset. Right? So it goes beyond ethnic boundaries or boundaries of us and other. And it already implies a kind of a universal human nature that can perhaps be redeemed by a single savior. So I'm just interested in that thought. And then the second is more about different strands of Hinduism. And would you say that Hinduism, just even as like different things, complex, but it seems that some would argue that dharma is our understanding and perhaps does not persist for all times in all versions of the universe. And so that would somewhat undermine this idea of natural law. I would say, well, there's a dharma that applies now, that it fits these circumstances, but perhaps in another universe, another cycle of being, there could be a different dharma. I wonder what you'd say about that as well. So two easy questions.
Thank you so much. I think the question of applicability is an intriguing one, because Louis Dumont, in his study, Homo Hierarchus, tries to point out how the different ways societies are structured means that the very notion of equality actually doesn't have a unitary meaning. So that you can have some societies, I mean, we can see this, say, if we look in the dogmatic constitution of the church, we can see a religious has a particular role whose goal is holiness, and the religious person will seek it in particular ways. The married person will have the same goal and seek it in different ways, etc. So we have a very complicated, stratified universe. The dharmic issue of applicability, and this is, I think, Ganeri's great point, it's not universal in the way that we understand it, but in terms of the prudential application of it in the caste system and then in the different roles and in the different periods, what we have is the attempt, as we do in the history of Christian thought, of how to understand universal laws and rules over time, not applied in flat societies, but in complex societies. So I'm not entirely sure that it's a problem. Well, one, it's not a problem for Hindus until neo-Hinduism comes about in the modern period, where there has to be a question of how does the dharma apply to non-Hindus, and then you get the development of neo-Hinduism saying what it does. You know, the religions in some ways carry out dharmic rules in their particular way, but they've encrusted in it all sorts of odd exclusive claims, etc., etc. So in that sense, neo-Hinduism does attempt to universalize the Dharma in a way that classical Hinduism doesn't. I mean, if you're not a Hindu, you're just out of it. You know, the best way is you get reincarnated eventually, become a Hindu, and then you'll eventually get reincarnated and become a Brahmin, male, and then you can make it. So I don't know whether that's an actual problem, the complexity of the context of applicability, because the Dharma itself is a universal law that pervades all things. But then we come to your second question, does it? And really, you know, the answer has to be differentiated. So I give an instance of one particular ritual act which doesn't even operate anymore. But to me, this testing of the ITC's document would simply require a constant attempt to speak to different metaphysical, cosmological forms of Hinduism to test out where the points of contact are. So we have, you know, certain forms of Hinduism with a very atheistic universe. What do we do there? Answer is start searching for points of contact which could have a resonance. I use Dharma simply because the ITC throw it out as the way to approach Hinduism, but I acknowledge that when we talk about actual concrete religions, we just have to speak very specifically, both in time and space, because there's huge variety and huge difference. So I'm not daunted by the possibility that there will be cases that just at the moment, we can't find a connection. But in the main schools of Hinduism, the law of Dharma still operates, I would contest. So yeah, big task, very specific conversations. Easier to do business possibly with theistic Hinduism, which is what Martin Ganeri's argument is compared to non-theistic forms. But I think what's very interesting is even the non-theistic forms are operating with Dharma.
Thank you. That's really a very fascinating presentation, Gavin. I was just going to note that, you know, of course, you know, somebody, I don't know everywhere, so it's a broken record, but I think it's interesting to underscore how the work that Aquinas does on natural law is not just about what we know about natural law, but what we can realize we don't know, or where there's a tragic, an opening to the tragic in the condition that the natural law can underscore. And for example, he's very clear in his commentary on natural law as pertains to the opening to the Judaic revelation, that human beings are naturally inclined to sacrifice because they know that they are sinful with regards to the divine or the gods. They know not how to make good sacrifice, and they seek in various cultural ways to figure that out. That they know they need somehow to make reparation and merit, but they lack, because of the effects of sin, the capacity without grace, which is unknown to them, to muster the resources to rightly merit their own salvation and that of others. They know there's a spiritual principle in that lives on after death. They know not how that could exist without re-embodiment. And so they're tempted to believe in reincarnation, as he says, or think of metempsychosis, or to despair of life after death. And they don't know how to make a good passage into the next world. And they know that they need to intercede for others in the solidarity of others in this world and the next. But they know not how that will work out. So he's trying to show these aphoria that are built into the limits of rational access to religion, that we are, vulnerable to tragic configurations of religious behavior. But at the same time, what's amazing is he's showing how noble it is that we would try to configure ourselves religiously towards the sacred. And in a sense, he leaves you free to say that some of the practices you're underscoring could be more natural than people who give up on sacrifice, or atonement, or merit, or the divine, or life after death. And so in some ways, this kind of society is more natural than a society that has given up sacrifice. I mean, I raised the question provocatively back to your provocative example. So I just think that there's all kinds of ways that the Christological resolution of natural law is also about helping us fix the conundrums or the aphoria that surround us with regards to the danger of religion when we don't entirely know how to please the gods, if I can put it that way. But that's just a comment, but it's a Thomistic comment in complement to your explorations.
Thank you very much. If I could just make two very brief comments, agreeing with you and saying hurrah, that's helpful. I think the first, and it's an interesting one, this is just a slightly casual comment, having presented something like this to a Hindu audience when I was in India doing the TEEP lectures, I'm feeling a bit scared about how they might react. One question came up was, in Catholicism, you have Mary as a co-redeemer. I was a bit sort of shocked at the connection, but Julia Leslie, who's translated these texts, makes a very interesting point that in terms of looking at mainstream tradition of Hinduism, here is a single point where women actually are given free agency to carry out redemptive acts, which only the priest can usually do. So that the level of the person's sacrifice, because the Brahmin priest has to be pure, but he doesn't have this kind of power that the woman who does the sacrifice. So there's an interesting theme. The second point I was wanting to make is that some of the early Catholic missionaries in India immediately focused on the sacrificial practices within Hinduism as points of analogy, whereas the Protestant missionaries saw in that type of Hinduism a terrible popism, sort of priests, smoke bells, and a reproduction of what they disliked most in Catholicism. So I think there's something quite significant about looking for the patterns in sacrifice. So thank you for that comment.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. And my question is, Sati and Hinduism. Sati and Hinduism. Did it occur before Christ or after Christ? Did they use it before Christ or after Christ?
Would you just repeat?
Did they observe this before Christ or after Christ?
Right. The evidence for the practice is certainly from the 1400s. We have evidence that this is carrying on. The high point is in the 1600s, carries on until the 20th century when it becomes, well, 19th century when it's made illegal in India, but evidence of it carrying on afterwards. Pre that, before Christ, there's no clear evidence that sati is practiced before Christ, as far as I know, from the main studies. But the Vedic sacrificial tradition is definitely going back before Christ, if I've got your question.
At risk of making this even more controversial, we can imagine that religions are infiltrated by forces of darkness. You keep talking about how horrible this practice is. Why would we want to say that this is the deformation of the natural law instead of demonic influence upon this religion? Since it seems to almost, mock our, martyrdom or try to deform martyrdom.
No, I mean, I think it's, well, I started by saying I think it's terrifying, evil, and wrong. But I'm also aware that in terms of making these judgments, the importance is to, in engaging with other religions, is to look at the inner logic. So I'm not kind of wanting to step back from just calling a spade. It's clear that the work of Satan is prevalent. Humans have fallen. We get sin in structural forms in other religions. All those things I'm saying are great. But when we apply it without looking at the inner logic of what's going on. So this is, feminists have a field day in terms of looking at the tradition of sati. It seems, patriarchy gone to its height. You basically destroy and burn women after they've served their function in marriage. That's another way of looking at it. But I think if we want to look at it in the best possible way as it is presented in Hinduism, we just have to look at the accounts I've looked at and see that there is an inner logic that is interesting. And at the end, I guess, I'm not sure how to answer your question. It seems to me, yes, it is dark, evil, and destructive. And even in the middle of that, there's a seed. I think that's why I felt there was a kind of connection between the discussion happening at the end of yours. There's a seed of a searching to do the good. And it's become so perverted. I think you were your question about people who are abused, etc., and that's a cycle of violence. I mean, the interesting question there is, does the abuser and the abused in any way seek love in what they are doing? We know that the goal of what happens cannot be love. But if we look at someone like, say, Alice Miller in her study of Hitler, which is a very remarkable psychological study, there's no questioning that Hitler was just a bad, bad person and one must condemn his acts. But what Miller is trying to do is understand that Hitler's ways of acting, rather than just running to Satan too quickly, may be formed of patterns of defamation that, like you said, are being passed on. But strangely enough, the acts of defamation are the seeking of something really significant. So it's just wanting to say life's complex. But I think you may be right. You've got to stop short and say, no, it's not complex anymore, that's just plain evil. But I'm just saying I don't know when to say that.
I'm curious what sort of resources the Hindus brought up, or if we know, or you know rather, in the 19th century with the British in the Raj. What were their internal resources that they used to want to eliminate it? Because to me that would be interesting for the question of the awareness to be able to spot how maybe did they use dharmic resources deployed otherwise to undo this other. Anyway, if you can enlighten us, that'd be great.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can enlighten you in a very limited way here because I haven't studied that point. But what was interesting, so the missionaries were clear, wrong, ban it. What was going on in terms of neo-Hinduism at the time is a concern to defend Hinduism against the attacks by Christians and secular West. There were certain practices that were seen as barbaric, outrageous, etc., etc. Key of it was Sati. So in the presentation that was made against Sati to the British government, it was an attempt to say this is not part of our tradition. Now, Trambakayajan's work, going back to the 16th century, who's a royal court Brahmin, is very selective. Now, he's drawing on the scriptures, he's drawing on the Vedas, so his arguments are actually hardcore, but they're not accepted widely within Hinduism. It's particular caste groups, the Rajput warrior groups tend to have a much closer connection to this. So it is interesting, there were not religiously complex claims being made that we need to reread the tradition in this way, etc., etc. It was simply saying it's not part of the tradition. In the same way that we look at Radhakrishnan's work as a neo-Hindu, and he reinterprets caste entirely for Western consumption. And you think, what? All of the stuff we learned is wrong. And, you know, Radhakrishnan argues, yes, it's been transmitted wrong. But of course, he was there available for Western consumption and had very little following or actual authority amongst Hindu pundits. So I think there's a kind of sense in which clean up the act, we're not to be criticized by the West. In fact, very soon after this, the main attack against the West from Hindus is these are exclusivist religions that are intolerant. We as Hindus, and this is interesting in terms of your question, Father Ed, are tolerant, are open. We accept all these different groups as connected with the divine. Whereas classically, if you're not a Hindu, you haven't made it. You're not even got a chance.
Sister, please.
I'm wondering about the reincarnation aspect of this, because it seems to me that must change the way you think about this. I mean, if you're thinking that the person is going to come back, this is a sort of maybe like snakes and ladders, a sort of boss ladder up to, you know, so it might see it completely different. I mean, I'm interested in how this life that each person has in the way relates to this ongoing process, and whether we really can't understand it already. I don't know.
Yes, yes. That's a great question. In the longer original version of the paper, you know, taking your point, Father Sullivan, and your point, I'm wanting to make it clear that I don't think points of contact are anything other than that. They operate within a greater dissimilarity. Okay, so there's not an attempt to try and map these doctrines on one for one. It's trying to look for patterns. But to take the question you're raising about reincarnation, it does actually throw a totally different spotlight on the moral endeavor, but it also has a point of continuity, because the purpose of reincarnation is so that the person's good acts that accrue merit, the person undergoes suffering if they've had a lot of bad acts, come back as an ant, etc., etc. And then you have to look at the different groups of Hinduism to plot how it is you make the final escape, okay? So that, I mean, a very interesting example here, which is just jumping to Buddhism for a moment, and this is because of interreligious dialogue. Lots of people are very keen on the Dalai Lama. He's a great guy, lovely smile, and he's very tolerant towards other religions. But one has to understand that tolerance actually operates in the context of reincarnation. There's no need to convert, because basically, if you're a good Christian, you eventually come to a level of maturity that you will be reincarnated as a Buddhist. And then if you're a good Buddhist, you will eventually get to the level of being reincarnated as a Deluk Buddhist, which is one of 18 different Buddhist groups. And then if you're a really good Deluk Buddhist, you come back reincarnated as a male monastic Deluk Buddhist. From that platform, you can get release. Okay, so at first sight, lovely tolerance, and I don't think he's dissembling, it's just that the worldview operates in that way. What seems at first sight as lovely tolerance is super duper exclusivism at its highest level, including for males only, but it actually isn't really, because the gender falls off. So it's a bit irrelevant. But I think the point you're making is great, that points of similarity need to be understood within points of difference. But then that's what analogy has always been to some extent. Now, the question is, are there patterns that allow us to have a conversation? Because we're not disputing, you know, as Jews, Muslims, and Christians do, issues of so-called shared revelation or not. But yes, I think it brings about a difference. It almost brings about a laid-backedness for these types of questions, whereas that laid-backedness doesn't operate in the Western traditions, because it really counts when you die. But it, you know, the interesting question, sorry, I won't go on, is the Sati. What happens? She actually gains release according to this text, and she will not come back in the cycles of reincarnation. Now that's also a bit eccentric on his part, but again, we have to look at varieties of texts. But that's also quite interesting, that not only can she redeem herself from the cycles of birth and rebirth, but also take her husband and the relatives through that act. Of course, when they are released, they're not the husband and the relatives, and neither is she. So we've got something, again, different to make sense of.
Join me in thanking Professor Gavin D'Costa for